So when I introduced myself on Saturday, I said that I had put up my hand to talk about compassion because I wasn't sure how much I knew about compassion, and that I wanted to challenge myself to dive deeply into the topic. But over this past month, as I've been preparing, I've come to find that actually I know a lot more about compassion than I thought, that it's alive for me every day, all the time. So what is compassion? Well, I think it's hard for us to put something like that into words, but the classic definition is that when one is infused with metta and one encounters suffering, that the result is compassion. So compassion is something that recognizes our interconnectedness. So when one part of the body is harmed, the whole body feels the effect. If I step on a splinter, my whole body responds to the pain. My hand may reach down and pull out the splinter, but the whole body is going to try to help to heal that wound. And when we see ourselves as interconnected, we would have that same response, that when we see one of us in pain and suffering, we're naturally going to want to see if we can find a way to alleviate that suffering. So I'd like to share a short reading from the Pali Canon, just a story about how that response might come up, what the Buddha had to say about that. And this is quoted from Analayo's book, Compassion and Emptiness. It is just like a person who is on an extended journey along a long road. Becoming sick halfway, he is exhausted and suffering extremely. He is alone and without a companion. The village behind is far away, and he has not reached the village ahead. Suppose now a person comes and, standing to one side, sees that this traveler on an extended journey along a long road has become sick halfway, is exhausted and suffering extremely. He is alone and without a companion. The village behind is far away, and he has not yet reached the village ahead. This second person thinks, if he were to get an attendant, emerge from being in the wilderness far away, and reach a village or town, and were to be given excellent medicine and be fed with nourishing and delicious food, be well cared for, then in this way, this person's sickness would certainly subside. So here the Buddha says, that person has extremely compassionate, sympathetic, and kind thoughts in the mind towards this sick person. And that's the sort of response that we're trying to cultivate when we're working with compassion. Why do we practice compassion? So Dilgyo Khyentse Rinpoche, one of Bhante's teachers, said this: in this age, troubled by war, famine, disease, disasters, and physical and mental stress of all kinds, to think even for an instant of the welfare of others is an inconceivable merit. So, of course, one of the reasons we want to practice compassion is for the benefit of all beings. That the more compassion there is in the world, the more everyone will benefit, until perhaps one day we can all awaken and extinguish suffering for good. Another reason is self-transformation. That as we practice compassion, we begin to identify less with our own narrow ego and identify more with everyone else, all beings throughout the universe. How do we practice compassion? To me, one of the important elements is finding balance. Analayo talks about the two wings of the bird, compassion and wisdom. Compassion is that impulse to relieve the suffering. Wisdom gives us the knowledge to employ the appropriate means. This reminds me of the myth of Icarus. Icarus, you may recall, was given a set of wings that his father Daedalus had constructed out of bird feathers and beeswax. And Icarus used these wings to fly out of the prison that he and his father were entrapped in. Now, his father Daedalus had warned Icarus not to fly too close to the sun because the wax that held the wings together might melt. But Icarus was so excited, that he flew ever higher and higher until eventually the sun did melt the wax and he fell from the sky. Suffering can be like that sun. It can be hot. Think of a wound. When we have a wound on our hand or somewhere on the body and we touch near it, the whole body feels hot. Anger has that same quality. When we're caught up in anger, we feel hot. So we want to be able to come close enough to see the suffering, but meet it with metta rather than making it our own. We don't want that suffering to be my suffering. We want to see and experience the suffering, but we want to see it with wisdom. So yesterday, Shudayu mentioned the near and far enemies. One of the near enemies of compassion is horrified anxiety. We see the suffering, we identify with it, and we're horrified that that could be me. This is just the thing that we need to be careful about, because that can lead us to burnout. If we start to take on all of the suffering ourselves, we can burn ourselves up. Of course, we want to be sure to avoid the far enemy of compassion, cruelty, which is when we enjoy the suffering of others. So as we practice, we need to look for self-protection so that we can maintain an open heart, an open-hearted response to the suffering we encounter without getting too caught up in the particulars of that suffering. In the Dhammapada, the Buddha says, consequently, one should not neglect one's own spiritual welfare for the welfare of others, great as that may be. Clearly perceiving what constitutes one's personal welfare, one should devote oneself to one's own good. So for me, that is the Buddha reminding us that we must work with our own situation so that we will be able to be of service to others. Those who have heard me before may have tired, but I love this analogy. When you get on the plane, what does the stewardess tell you? Put on your own oxygen mask before you try to put on someone else's. That's what I mean by self-protection. So that's all I'm going to say specifically about compassion right now. The next area that I'd like to talk a little bit about is what are sometimes called the preliminaries. I know for myself, too often I have a busy day. I have a certain block of time that I've set aside for meditation. So I trot right up to my cushion, plop myself down, ding, hit the bell, and oh yeah, it's time to start meditating. So the Buddha actually had quite a different suggestion about how we might go about getting ready. So in the Anapanasati Sutta, here's what the Buddha says. Here, gone to a forest or the root of a tree or to an empty hut, one sits down, having folded the legs crosswise, keeping the body erect, and having established mindfulness to the fore. Mindful, one breathes in, and mindful, one breathes out. So you might think this is the description of meditation. But no, this is what the Buddha suggests that we do before we begin the meditation. So I'd like to just try to unpack a little bit about what is contained here. So first off, the Buddha suggests that we find the appropriate place. And he suggests the forest, the root of a tree, or an empty hut. So we may not have a handy forest or even the root of a tree or an empty hut to sit in, but we want to find a place where we know we can be undisturbed as we practice our meditation. And then there's posture. Here the Buddha suggests we sit down and fold the legs crosswise, keeping the body erect. Not all of us have the supple body of youth where we can actually sit like the Buddha would have sat. So it's all right to find our own seat, but it should have that quality of intentionality. It should be as upright as possible. And let's not forget that posture involves more than just the body. So the next thing that the Buddha suggests is having established mindfulness to the fore. So what does that mean? Well, it certainly means that we want to have established awareness. Perhaps we want to have connected with the purpose for which we've come to our meditation. Some commentators suggest that here the Buddha is saying we also want to have reduced or perhaps even eliminated the hindrances, the 5 factors that can keep us from meditative absorption. Eliminating the hindrances is, in my case, quite a formidable task. And then the final instruction is mindful one breathes in and mindful one breathes out. So I'd like to just suggest that we try that just for a moment right now. That we just allow ourselves to notice, I am breathing in, or notice, I am breathing out. So I don't think that the Buddha chose this simple instruction by accident. There's no work to be done here other than simple awareness of something that's in our experience every moment we're alive. Just the simple act of breathing in and breathing out. But when we bring our attention to the breath, the Buddha knew that we would start to become more aware of our present experience, that we would become a little more calm, that our experience would be a little brighter. And I bring this up because, for me anyway, to successfully cultivate compassion, I need to have a positive mental state. And that comes for me through cultivation of joy and happiness. Joy and happiness for me have the same feeling tone as metta, as loving kindness. And the Buddha in the Anapanasati Sutta has 2 stanzas where we work on coming into contact with the presence of joy and happiness in our lives. So what are some of the things that might give rise to joy that we can start to try to appreciate in our lives? First off is seclusion itself. Just the chance to step aside from this crazy world we live in. And then there's the opportunity to live a life of moral restraint, practicing the precepts. We know that when we make good ethical choices, our life starts to go better. We experience freedom. And of course, joy may come when we recognize that we have access to the 3 jewels, to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. Another potential source of joy is we're able to follow a practice that the Buddha used. And then, of course, happiness and contentment. For me, that flows out of gratitude. Gratitude to our teachers, gratitude to our friends, and appreciation for everything that we have. Just this opportunity to be together. So I'd like to invite you to take a few moments to just notice what joy, what happiness there may be in your experience. We're not looking to bring something into being that's not there already. We're just looking to find it. And when we find it, we can bring attention to it. And when we bring attention to it, it begins to grow. So if you're comfortable with it, try taking your right hand and placing it on your heart, and then take your left hand and place it on your belly. And tuning into the body, just taking a few moments to look for joy, to look for happiness. Wishing that your lives may be filled with joy and happiness. In the Majjhima Nikaya, the Buddha says, "So monks, I have opened up the safe, restful path, closed off the false path. Whatever a teacher should do, seeking the welfare of his disciples out of compassion for them, that have I done for you. Over there are places to sit, the roots of trees. Over there are empty dwellings. Practice, monks. Don't be heedless. Don't later fall into remorse. This is our message to you." So that's all I'm going to say about the practice of compassion today. And now we're going to try a bit of practice. So we're going to take a 5-minute break so that you can do anything you might need to do before we sit. In this practice, I'm going to lead it according to the formula that's laid out in Kamala Shila's book on meditation. And so there'll be specific people that you'll be encountering in the practice. First off is someone who has experienced suffering, and then the familiar good friend, the person we don't know very well, and the person with whom we may have some difficulty. So during this break, I recommend that you try to select those people now so that when the time comes during the practice, you won't have to think about it. You'll already have them in mind. So my clock says 3 minutes after the hour. Let's be back at 8 minutes after the hour. Going to do much in the way of leading. At the beginning of each stage, I'll remind you about who's in that particular stage. But other than that, I'm going to leave you to work with bringing that response of metta to the suffering you may encounter. So I'll just run through the stages as Kamala Sheila describes them right now. First stage will be developing metta or loving kindness towards ourselves. In the second stage, we'll develop metta or loving kindness for that person you selected who is experiencing suffering. In the third stage, we'll develop compassion towards a friend, being aware of their suffering. In the fourth stage, we'll develop compassion towards a neutral person, for someone we don't know very well, being aware of their suffering. In the fifth stage, we'll develop compassion towards a difficult person, being aware of their suffering. And then we'll, in the sixth stage, develop Karuna or compassion for all four people equally, being aware of their suffering, and then extend out gradually towards all beings throughout the universe, becoming aware of their suffering. So find the posture that you wish to take for the meditation, recalling that posture is body, heart, and mind. I'd just like to share this bit of advice for meditation that I found in the Triratna Puja book. It's without attribution, but it's in the Zen section, so I suspect it may be a Zen prayer. Body like a mountain, heart like the ocean, mind like the sky. The Karuna Bhavana. In the first stage, we develop loving kindness for ourselves. For the second stage, we bring to mind someone we know who is experiencing suffering, and we meet that suffering with loving kindness. We may wish to use some of the traditional phrases. May you be well. May you be happy. May you be free from all suffering. May you be free from the causes of suffering. Some people find that visualizing works better than the phrases. For example, you might visualize the Buddha visiting that person who is suffering and offering them a sip of amrita, the nectar that eases all suffering. In the third stage, we develop compassion towards a friend. It's easy to meet our friend with loving kindness, but we're aware that they share with all beings the experience of suffering. In the fourth stage, we develop Karuna, compassion, towards a neutral person, someone we don't know very well. We recognize that they're another human being and that, like ourselves, they are experiencing suffering in their lives. And we developed a heartfelt wish that they may be free of that suffering. In the fifth stage, we develop Karuna, compassion, towards a person with whom we may have had some difficulty. We're aware that they are another human being, and like us, they experience suffering in their lives. We might greet them something like this: Friend, no matter what has come between us, the door to my heart will always be open to you. May you be free from all suffering. In the final stage, we develop Karuna, compassion towards all of the people that we've worked with equally, ourselves, the person we know is suffering, our good friend, the person we don't know very well, and the person with whom we may have some difficulty. We cultivate an equal compassion for all of those people. We're aware of their suffering. We're aware of how, as human beings, we share that suffering. And then gradually we start to extend our circle of compassion outwards towards all beings throughout the universe, aware of their suffering, and with a heart like an ocean, we hold that suffering. Just pausing for a moment to recollect, remember the elements of our experience, this practice of compassion. I have to say, the last stage of this practice doesn't seem long enough. My heart barely got out of the solar system. There's still a lot more of the universe that I just haven't gotten to yet. It seems like the final stage should go on for quite a long time.